Okay. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you for being here this morning, bright and early. So let's just get into the talk. I'll first and foremost introduce our speakers. To my immediate left is Dasha is a Spring member based out of Toronto. And to Dasha's left in the wonderful glasses is Suzanne MacNeil, a Spring member coming to us from Halifax. So let's give it up for coming all the way from Halifax. What's wonderful. Yeah. And yes, and just before we really do hand it over to our speakers, just to explain how the meeting will work, speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes. Then we'll have questions from the floor, questions from the floor. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the end of their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, please, of course, raise your hand, and you'll be added to the speakers list. And as always, we'll be using an equity speakers list, which means you may not be called on the sequence that you raise your hand or responded to, but we'll prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers as well. Questions and or comments are welcome, but you do please try to keep your contribution to 3 minutes absolute maximum. And of course, we encourage you to post to social media throughout the day to share your thoughts and experiences. You can use the hashtag RedOctober2025, and you can tag Spring on all platforms at SpringMag.ca. Okay, so now we'll go over to our speakers, and we'll be starting with Suzanne.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for coming. A lot of us are attracted to the politics and ideas of socialism because we have a sense that many of the interrelated problems facing us under capitalism, such as climate change, the extreme polarization of wealth, various oppressions such as racism, the concentration of power into the hands of the few, these things don't have surface level solutions. We know that deeper systemic change is needed, and a lot of us look to a horizon of a meaningfully, revolutionarily transformed society. The stakes are high. These days, more people are coming to the conclusion that profound change is necessary, but we are seeing that many working class people are being drawn very strongly to right-wing ideas and solutions to their problems. We see this kind of politics at work in the scapegoating of trans and queer people, organizing around anti-immigrant sentiment as a response to housing and affordability crises, the doubling down of environmentally destructive industries to preserve and create jobs, and other examples of reactionary approaches. These sorts of dynamics have placed far-right politicians into positions of power and have compelled otherwise center or left leaders to make concessions and even opportunistically embrace some of the right's policy and rhetoric. We are seeing the word fascism enter mainstream political discourse as we try to describe what's happening right now. So for those of us who want to build a politics based on solidarity, equity, care, and free from all forms of oppression, where do we go from here? It's not always obvious what the roadmap is to achieve this kind of society. We are, revolutionary socialists in Spring, and, saying that we need a revolution is one thing. But right now, the working class is not particularly strong or well organized, especially after decades of neoliberal assault on some of the victories that workers have won over the past century. We are, of course, in this talk going to be focusing on elections and left electoral politics. On the electoral scene in Canada, we've seen, most recently, the collapse of the NDP vote in the 2025 federal election, for a social democratic party that, has its flaws and faults. It is probably the main expression of a worker's approach to electoral politics. And there's other examples of left electoral efforts that we welcome people to mention in the discussion. It is not always clear to us that elections are a good use of our time and energy when parliamentary power under capitalism has very limited means to affect the day-to-day lives of working class people for the better. And intuitively, a lot of people, whether they pay attention to politics or not, they know this. The alienation from our parliamentary system is very deep. Anyone who knocks on doors or canvasses their neighborhoods encounters this a lot. If we compare even the limited form of democracy that exists in our political system to the forms of power that exist in our workplaces and the corporations that rule the economy, we can very quickly see that we live under a kind of dictatorship of bosses and billionaires. So in this situation, it is tempting to think one of two things. The first, that elections are simply a waste of time, that we can never get anything meaningful accomplished in the electoral realm, and that we need to focus on other kinds of activities. And the second thing that would be tempting to think is that because the working class is weak, that we need to elect left-wing people into public office in order to implement changes and reforms that would bring about socialism for us. And maybe a third that I'll shoehorn in here is like the very common sort of liberal bourgeois sentiment that, like, you know, voting is like your moral duty, which, you know, Dasha is going to talk in her section a little later on electoralism. So with all of that, there are indeed some realities that we need to face. When the left is elected into power, billionaires and powerful corporations don't hesitate to use their power to discipline and keep in line governments who try to implement any reforms that go against capitalist interests, you know, the kind of reforms that make life better for workers and oppressed people. Without a strong, organized working class capable of exercising our own power, the left in elected office often faces a choice of either betraying its working class base or, you know, being deposed by capitalist interests one way or another. And there are so many examples of when this happens. But ignoring elections altogether would mean failing to engage workers and oppressed peoples at a time when they're most likely to be paying attention to politics and to what options are making the case for their vote. The far right certainly does not abstain from the electoral arena, and they are often very good at using it as a bully pulpit for their ideas, and as an opportunity to get in front of their audiences, build their networks of support, that kind of thing. So we do need to meet workers and oppressed peoples where they're at now, and not where we wish they were. We, as socialists, we need to find a way to relate to elections in a way that makes the case for our ideas and strategies for change. Look at it as an opportunity to build solidarity across difference, build organizing relationships, and test our methods and proposals for change. We often have very strong feelings about elections and certain political parties on the left. And, you know, we from the front of the room certainly don't have like any easy one-size-fits-all answers to this matter. But we do want to make the case, you know, with no illusions about what's possible in any given moment, that our approach to elections needs to be on the level of strategy and tactics. You know, overall, as socialists, we are trying to build a mass movement of the working class and oppressed peoples, and need to consider all of the tools available at our disposal.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So every time an election comes around, we're told that our participation in democracy is our sole duty to shape our country into this nation that works for everyone. And like clockwork, leaders in their political parties start to plead and make promises, begging us to vote them in, and they're gonna make everything better. It's a very compelling story for many people, one that places the burden of salvation entirely on our ballots, while absolving the political class and the capitalist system itself of all the blame. Electoralism, in simple terms, is a belief that political change can only be achieved through elections. It means if we have the right leader, the right party, and they have the right policies, the system will fix itself. This is the myth of liberal democracy, that the system is fair, responsive, and capable of representing our interests, all without ever challenging who truly holds power or who our economy is designed to serve. Socialism has one fundamental goal: to place power, resources, the value of our labor, and its wealth into the hands of the working class. Casting a vote for someone who says they share that goal gives us a feeling of progress. We can wait for the perfect liberator, and once they're in any position of power, we say, peace out, and go back to our life and pretend as if we're absolved from the responsibility of shaping our world that they govern. We give out our vote, abdicate our power, and then disengage. At first glance, electoralism might seem almost intuitive. At our core, we all want the same thing: safety, dignity, fulfillment. And what if the majority of people in this country want a socialist society? Why can't we just elect leaders who promise to build it? The assumption here is that democracy, power, and the role of the state will simply move in tandem with the will of the majority. But this faith in elections ignores a brutal truth, which is that capitalism is designed to protect itself, and it doesn't react well to existential threats. The state itself is not an impartial tool waiting to be wielded by whoever wins the next election. It's a deeply entrenched apparatus engineered to preserve existing power structures, protect the institution of private capital, and maintain the dominance of the ruling class. Its laws, police, bureaucracy are all calibrated to serve the interest of the 1% and suppress any movement that undermines it. People's first instinct when they think about political change is voting. When the colors change from red to blue, orange, or green, it's going to feel like a fresh start. All of that is just theater of electoral politics. In reality, we will all be disappointed. Everyone in this room is disappointed. The intricate challenge here is to get people to ask why. Why are we so disappointed? Why does it feel like everything is rigged against us? Because it is. And we have to make sure that a politician isn't around to feed people a bumper sticker solution. Short of a revolution, we still have to function within the current structure and navigate against its limitations to seize every possible advantage. Reform can provide direct relief for the working class, like by giving us access to free medication, for example. We can celebrate those wins, but this just highlights gaps in a system that treats basic healthcare as a bargaining chip. As we engage with electoral politics, we as socialists must remain really clear-sighted. Reforms can help raise the political consciousness of the working class, reveal the deep contradictions within capitalism itself, and provide vital relief for people so they can continue to organize. We must be very cautious, though, because the electoral arena becomes a graveyard of movements. It's a place where radical ideas are softened, powerful leaders are neutralized, and our energy gets absorbed by the system we set out to dismantle. Elections must be our tactic and not our strategy. Real transformation comes from sustained struggle, not campaign promises. It's in the street, the workplace, and the communities where power is built and contested. Without mass movements behind them, even the most perfect candidate is left negotiating with a system that is resisting change. Our collective autonomy will not be granted to us in a voting booth, but it will be seized through mass mobilization, won through direct action, and secured by organized working class solidarity.
Thanks, Dasha. So we do want to contemplate different examples of what happens when the left does come to power electorally, both here in the Canadian state and internationally. After I say my piece, Dasha is going to talk about a bit about the Canadian context, and I want to talk about some international examples. We could really fill like an entire half hour and more listing and evaluating the different like left electoral examples globally, and we're not going to do that. But you know, we do welcome that in the discussion for sure. If anyone's particularly has thoughts about particular examples, you know, we could look at the example of Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain. We could talk about like what's happening in the UK now with, we have a Labour Party in power, and also this maybe emerging your party thing that, you know, folks might have something to say about, but is like, you know, it's a currently developing thing. For this like next couple minutes, I want to talk about the pink tide in Latin America. If you're not familiar with it, it refers to the election of several left and center-left governments, particularly in South America, during the first decade of this century. These governments, particularly in Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, Argentina, and others, for a lot of leftists globally at the time, they represented this very exciting policy of a promise and possibility of a left coming into a kind of power that was capable of confronting the neoliberal capitalist Washington consensus. And particularly as this region was particularly victimized by a certain kind of interventionism during the Cold War, it was very gratifying for people to see this dynamic emerging. So the governments in these countries of the region, like Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism in Bolivia, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, these leaders, they came into power riding a wave of both new and reinvigorated social movements, looking at like the indigenous movements in Bolivia, particularly around some of the flashpoints of uprising opposing water privatization in the country, the unemployed workers movement in Argentina, the landless movement in Brazil, the really remarkable reversal of the right-wing coup against Hugo Chavez and his return to power as a result of popular mobilization. These various governments, have a lot of critiques about them now, from the whole, from the whole sort of political spectrum. But it is worth, contemplating that, previous to the pink tide, the right was in power almost everywhere in the region, and there wasn't much in the way of, strong and established left political parties in the electoral arena. So, and this next thing I'm going to say, like, keep in mind I'm speaking very much in generalities about some complex and nuanced history, but part of what underwrote the electoral success and the tenure of left governments in this era was in huge part the commodities boom that was fueled by China. Governments at the time were able to generate considerable revenues through the exports of oil and natural gas and other commodities. And this period was so lucrative that the effects of the 2008 global financial crisis were delayed in this region until about 2012 or so. The end of the pink tide era in the 2010s does leave us with socialists with a couple pieces to contemplate. The fact that the era of economic prosperity meant that states were able to both accommodate capital and the ruling classes, who did not have, there were a number of things like nationalization of key industry, but overall sort of the capitalist interests, they still generated large profits. And governments were able to do this while still serving the left's social and electoral base for a time, with social spending, cash transfer programs, efforts to address food security and other things. So in this dynamic, the left was able to avoid, confronting the question of class antagonism. And during this period, it's also observed by a lot of folks in the region and other commentators globally that key social movement leaders and cadre in a number of countries, this was particularly a dynamic in Bolivia, were often absorbed into the state apparatus, which meant that building and maintaining power from below often took a backseat to maintaining their hold onto state power. Unfortunately, with different global economic events like the collapse of oil prices in 2014, was particularly devastating to this region, including notably Venezuela, where revenues from its state-run petroleum company were critical to the functioning of the state and social programs that largely benefited the working class. And the late 2010s, because of the social dissatisfaction that this sowed, the late 2010s saw a return of right-wing governments who largely benefited from the crisis electorally. And for the domestic context, I'll pass things back over to Dasha.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can you hear me? Okay. So despite countless election cycles in Canada, we still have growing inequality, our forests are on fire, there's relentless oppression of Indigenous communities and systematic defunding of our public services. As we examine the limitations of elections, we can understand why they seem to be this insufficient form of democracy that won't deliver the radical progressive changes we can all envision. One of the biggest myths of liberal democracy is that voters, and only voters, decide the future and that the policies are shaped by the people. Although Parliament holds immense power and they have the final say, their true power is held in the boardrooms, lobbyist offices, private equity firms, think tanks, billionaire group chats, and all of this is conveniently away from the public eye. I'm sure we've all heard the saying, Canada is 3 telecommunications companies in a trench coat. Corporate lobbying across industries is well-funded and opaque. These corporations spend millions in shaping legislation, neutering regulatory bodies, and even writing policy frameworks themselves. Socialism and reform struggles to have any wins in Canada because we're not just fighting with politicians and their legislative gridlock. We're up against a well-oiled corporate machine that has the time and the money to protect the status quo. Too often, the formula for political survival is to compromise with power. We saw this in the NDP's confidence and supply agreement with the Liberal minority government in 2022. This was the first nail in the coffin that led to this year's disastrous performance in the federal election. This is a predictable pattern in which working class demands are stripped for their progressive edge and then paraded around as achievements for liberalism. The Liberals dragged the NDP along, pocketing their victories, while the NDP was tarnished by the Liberal Party's neoliberal agenda. At the time, Jagmeet Singh defended his position by saying that he didn't care if the Liberals took credit over his pharmacare push, as long as it helped people. And yeah, like, the help is undeniable, but it's a tiny short-term victory that cedes long-term power. It's naive to think this approach wouldn't be deliberately stalled and watered down as much as it was in the end. To this day, majority of jurisdictions are not fully enrolled in pharmacare because the NDP allowed the Liberals to strip the legislation of many binding deadlines. A core constraint holding back the left in Canada is their function as controlled opposition. They're still beholden to the logic of the current economy. As the NDP speaks the language of justice and equity, it does this within the boundaries of capitalism, and it doesn't confront it directly. The NDP pushed through pharmacare and dental care, but doesn't challenge the rapid privatization happening within the provinces. They criticize Loblaws for price gouging and propose amendments to the Competition Act to push back against back against excessive market share mergers, but stopped short of properly calling for direct price capping. They championed the Sustainable Jobs Act, claiming to support worker-led transitions to renewable energy, yet they explicitly avoid opposing all the new pipeline projects that will decimate the environment. They stress the importance of national rent control and tenant protections, but draw the line at undermining the real estate industry or advocating for housing to be fully decommodified altogether. Their focus is to tax, to regulate, and incentivize the existing market to change instead of challenging the fundamental undemocratic ownership of the market itself. All political parties that hold office in Canada are just glorified capitalism managers. Their partisan bickering is solely over the speed and method of this management and never about their underlying imperative to serve capital. The Band-Aid fix of concessionary reform in many cases operates like a pressure valve that doesn't fix the problem, but just lets off a little steam for us as a treat. For example, last holiday season, we were given the GST HST break. Now, these measures helped all of us. All of our bills were, a tiny bit smaller. And this helped for seemingly a second. And what's happened after that? The cost of living didn't go down. This was political class managing our outcry. In the same vein, in March last year, Parliament passed a non-binding motion that took a tiny step to halt Canada's complicity in the arms flow to Israel by freezing new arms export permits. And what's happened since then? The government lied and allowed a flood of weapons parts to flow through the valid existing permits and the US, showing this all just to be optics and manipulation. We can't discuss electoralism in Canada without mentioning our first-past-the-post voting system. It reasonably makes sense. The candidate who gets the most votes wins the seat, but in reality, this leads to our diminished influence in democratic outcomes and a style of governments that prioritizes party interests over public sentiment. Trudeau famously ran on electoral reform and promised proportional representation, and this promise died as fast as the ink dried on his majority mandate. Why would they try to fix a system that is giving them power? And how can we even call it representative democracy when someone can be sent to Ottawa to represent a riding, even when 60% of voters in that community looked at that candidate and said, no, not you. This kind of false majority can result in strategic voting, which is a very demoralizing practice of settling for the lesser evil candidate. How many people in this room, or maybe someone you know, that has ruminated about splitting the left vote, or felt like your vote was pointless in a safe, liberal, or conservative riding? This past election, many people voted out of fear of the conservatives and their weirdo leader, which resulted in voters choosing names and parties that don't actually represent their interests. Election strategies for our winner-takes-all system lead to decisions where progressive candidates from the NDP and the Green Party drop out to protect the seat for a more electable liberal candidate. This isn't a united front because you never see the inverse of this happening. These campaign decisions also exploit our regional inequalities, where the focus is on trying to reach a specific type of low-propensity voter. This is very common, and I call this the Kamala Harris-Liz Cheney strategy, where you try to appeal to voters who don't exist while ignoring those who only need a tiny glimmer of fight on their behalf. The continuous demobilization of the left is, sometimes self-inflicted, but most of the time it's state-sponsored. Progressive ideas and grassroots movements are always deemed as unelectable, not because they don't have popular support, but because their political establishment rarely allows a serious attempt at a viable strategy to translate all of that momentum into electoral victory. But this only persists if we let it, and our mission as socialists is to reject this narrative, take up our revolutionary optimism, and organize in the face of this mess.
All right, thanks, Dasha. Chris, can we do a time check? All right, I'm taking about 2 minutes in this next session. All right, so anyway, thanks for that last section, Dasha. And, having no illusions does mean that we need to know the difference between a winning an election and being able to build power capable of confronting the capitalist class. I think it is worth, for this last little thing to consider what's happening, south of our border. The political system in the US is, of course, very different from what we're dealing with in Canada, but there are some very general similarities of a not very strong or organized working class left presence in elections. So it's usually worthwhile paying attention to, like, when we do see energetic left electoral efforts emerge. Zohran Mamdani's campaign for mayor of New York City has very much captured the excitement of leftists amidst Trump's authoritarian assaults, and for good reason. It does have an ethic of volunteer-driven activity that has activated an awful lot of people to get involved. Mamdani is a self-described socialist, but his campaign has this elegantly simple program of proposals on things like housing and free transit that would very much benefit the working class, and it's capable of broad appeal beyond the usual far-left suspects. Mamdani's personal appeal and the incredible grassroots machine of a campaign definitely achieved something remarkable when it won the Democratic nomination against former New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo, though this was due in no small part to Cuomo's overwhelmingly disgraced reputation. And we also need to understand, sort of the drastic, limits that sort of carrying the Democratic banner places on left-wing politicians in the States. The options that are available to Mamdani if he wins are quite another story beyond, mounting a successful campaign. If he wins, at least some of his promises will depend on levels of government decision-making that won't be under his jurisdiction. And there is every likelihood that the Democratic Party will try to moderate his more radical proposals, whether it's through trying to co-opt him, like they've done with, some other left-wing politicians, or by disciplining him in other ways. Those who are participating in his electoral campaign will need to stay involved to defend Mamdani from his opponents within and without the Democrats. And staying organized and mobilized beyond the election period has definitely been a challenge for this section of the left ever since, since forever, of course, but certainly since the early days of Bernie Sanders' mid-2010s primary challenges.
Okay, I'm going to talk really, really fast. So where does all of this leave us? Do we push the NDP to use this upcoming leadership race to adopt a socialist platform? Do we channel our energy into building a new independent party? Do we refuse to play a game that is stacked against us from the start? Socialists can harness the power of elections through two tactical paths. The first is joining the political establishment through an election, winning, and then brick by brick dismantling capitalist structures and replacing them with socialist ones. No matter how principled the candidates are, anyone entering parliament will be immediately isolated and outnumbered. The other strategy is to use elections not as a path to governance, but as a stage or a megaphone. This exposes people to policy proposals and lets them know what's possible, while also forcing opponents to either align with the popular demand we create or reckon with it out in the open. Perfect example is Zohran Mamdani's platform. At the debates, every single candidate on that stage has to come up with their own plan to make things even more affordable. Cuomo's team used ChatGPT to write a housing plan, which was amazing. This is putting working class demands into mainstream discourse. I would also love to know how many times Zohran Mamdani is mentioned at Red October, and what we talk about next year. People might go to a protest and seek out others in a neighborhood who also care. In election season, people are more welcoming to opening their doors and canvassing. Grassroots movements can channel this heightened energy into targeted campaigns and increase the leverage for the post-election period, which is where the fight for lasting change actually happens. Whether the plan is to join the state or to expose it, this is secondary to the necessity of the working class organized power. The constant debate of whether we work inside the system or outside of it can trap us in a cycle of infighting while the gears of the system continues to crush us. For us to see socialism in our future, it's not about choosing the one right path. It's to understand that we need to grow our movement that operates on multiple fronts at once. Whether the goal is reform or transformation, the project of socialism is, and always has been, the work of weaving on many threads into a single unbreakable fabric. Thank you.